racist cop pulled over a black man in a Rolls Royce, mocking him and accusing him of being a criminal. But what the officer didn't know was that the man behind the wheel was actually a top-ranked White House detective. By the end of the night, the officer's arrogance would destroy his career. Where are you watching this story from? Drop it in the comments and don't forget to subscribe for more powerful stories like this one. Now, let's get into it. The night was heavy, with the low hum of distant traffic as a black Rolls Royce Phantom glided silently through the streets of Washington, D.C. The car looked like liquid shadow under the glow of street lamps, its polished body reflecting amber light, as though it carried the night sky itself. Inside, behind tinted glass, sat a black man in his early 50s. His name was Christopher Jordan. Christopher wasn't loud in his presence. His tailored charcoal suit fit him like armor, and his silk tie was knotted with precision. A pair of sleek cufflinks glinted under the dashboard lights, subtle markers of refinement. On his wrist, a Patek Philippe watch ticked steadily, a quiet testament to time well earned. His face was calm, but there was an edge in his eyes, the kind of watchfulness honed over decades in dangerous environments. To Officer Daniel Briggs, parked in his patrol cruiser on the corner, the Rolls Royce didn't look like success. It looked like trouble. Briggs, a burly man with a buzz cut and a permanent scowl, had spent nearly 20 years on the force. In his mind, he knew the streets, but what he really knew was suspicion, and suspicion always fell heavier on men who looked like Christopher. Briggs narrowed his eyes. A black man in a $500,000 car at midnight. No way that checks out. With a flick of his thumb, he hit the switch. The patrol car's sirens screamed to life, red and blue lights cutting through the night like blades. The Rolls slowed, then stopped with smooth precision at the curb. Christopher lowered his window, the motion steady and deliberate. The cold night air swept in, carrying tension thick enough to choke on. Briggs swaggered up, flashlight in hand, and leaned into the window with the sneer of someone who already thought he had the upper hand. License and registration, he snapped, his hand resting conspicuously on the butt of his holstered gun. Christopher handed over the documents without a word, his gaze steady, almost surgical in its calm. Briggs glanced at the license, his lip curling. Christopher Jordan. His flashlight beam danced across the interior of the car, the leather seats, the polished dashboard, the watch on Christopher's wrist. The sight seemed to annoy him more than impress. "So, Mr. Jordan," Briggs said, his voice laced with condescension, "you want to tell me how a man like you gets his hands on a ride like this? Drug money? Some kind of scam? Or maybe you borrowed it off somebody who doesn't know you're out joyriding?" Christopher tilted his head slightly, his jaw tightening. His voice was low, even. "A man like me?" Briggs smirked, leaning closer, his tone dripping venom. "Don't play dumb. You don't fit in this picture. Men who look like you don't drive cars like this, unless something shady's going on." A few passing pedestrians slowed their steps, sensing the heat in the air. The street went quiet except for the ticking of the Rolls Royce engine and the shallow hum of the cruiser's lights. Christopher let the silence stretch before answering. "Be careful with your words, officer." Briggs chuckled coldly. "Or what? You'll file a complaint? Please, I've been in this job long enough to know how this works." Just then, Christopher's phone lit up on the console. The screen glowed briefly, displaying a call from a restricted number. But Briggs caught the insignia at the top of the lock screen before it vanished the seal of the White House. Briggs frowned, his bravado faltering. What's that supposed to mean? Christopher exhaled slowly, then reached into his suit jacket. Briggs's hand twitched on his holster, but Christopher's movements were deliberate, careful. From his inner pocket he pulled a sleek leather wallet and set it on the dashboard. The badge inside gleamed under the flashlight's glare. Special Agent Christopher Jordan, Chief Investigator, White House, Special Investigations Division. The blood drained from Briggs's face. His sneer dissolved into something closer to panic. Christopher's eyes sharpened as his voice dropped into a tone of unshakable authority. You see, Officer Briggs, I don't just drive this car. I don't just work a 9 to 5. I investigate threats to the highest office in this country. When I say I earn an honest living, I mean I've spent decades protecting presidents, dismantling terrorist cells, and standing between this nation and the people who want to tear it apart. Briggs swallowed hard. His hand slid away from his holster, trembling now. Christopher leaned forward, his words precise, deliberate. But tonight, instead of seeing a professional, instead of seeing a citizen, you saw nothing but my skin, and you drew your conclusions from that alone. That is not law enforcement. That is prejudice, with a badge. The silence that followed was unbearable. Briggs stammered, I didn't realize who you were. Christopher's voice cut him down. No, you didn't care who I was. You assumed who I wasn't. And if I hadn't been who I am, this encounter could have ended very differently. Isn't that right? Briggs's jaw worked soundlessly. His bravado was gone. The officer who thought he was in control now stood exposed, powerless in the shadow of the man he tried to demean. Christopher restarted the Rolls, the engine growling like a predator. He gave Briggs one last look, his eyes cold and unforgiving. Respect costs nothing, officer, he said, shifting the car into gear. But disrespect, tonight you learned it could cost you everything. The Rolls Royce slid away from the curb, disappearing into the night like a phantom, leaving Briggs stranded in his own flashing lights, heart hammering with shame. For the rest of the night, Briggs sat in his cruiser, replaying the moment in his head, the badge, the authority, the chilling truth that he had nearly destroyed himself with a single assumption. And he knew, deep down, that a report would be waiting for him by morning. The night Christopher Jordan drove away, Officer Daniel Briggs sat in his cruiser, his hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly that his knuckles turned white. His face burned, not just with humiliation, but with the slow dawning realization of what he had done. By morning, that realization became reality. At the Metropolitan Police Department headquarters, Briggs was called into the chief's office. The blinds were drawn, the air heavy. At the center of the desk lay a thick file marked Confidential White House Communication. The chief's face was grim. Sit down, Briggs. Daniel lowered himself into the chair, his chest tightening. The chief slid a printed report across the desk. Briggs recognized the name instantly, Christopher Jordan. This came in at dawn, the chief said. Special Agent Jordan filed a formal complaint against you. Not just with us, with internal affairs, with the Office of Professional Responsibility, and with the White House itself. Briggs swallowed hard. Chief, I didn't know who he was. The chief's eyes burned with restrained fury. That's the problem. You didn't care who he was. According to his statement and the dashcam footage, you profiled him, harassed him, and nearly escalated a situation with one of the highest-ranking security officials in the country. Do you have any idea the kind of firestorm this brings on this department? Briggs's throat went dry. I was just doing my job. The chief's voice cut sharp as glass. Your job is to uphold the law, not your own prejudices. You didn't just disrespect a citizen, Briggs. You disrespected an agent who has stood guard over 3 presidents, a man who has risked his life more times than you've written parking tickets, and the White House is watching this very closely. The room felt smaller with every word. The chief leaned forward, his voice low but lethal. You're suspended, effective immediately. Internal Affairs will conduct a full review. And frankly, Briggs, I don't expect you'll be back on these streets. You've made the entire department look like fools. Briggs felt his stomach drop. His badge, the thing he had once polished with pride, now felt like lead in his pocket. The review. 2 weeks later, a disciplinary panel convened. A sterile room, fluorescent lights humming overhead. 3 senior officers sat behind a long table, and at the far end sat Christopher Jordan, calm, precise, and immovable. On a large screen, the dashcam footage played. They watched as Briggs swaggered toward the Rolls Royce. They heard his tone, dripping with arrogance. They saw the flashlight beam dancing across Christopher's suit, his sneer as he asked about a man like you, owning such a car. Every pause, every word, every threat of implied violence. It was all laid bare in crystal clarity. When the footage reached the moment Christopher revealed his badge, silence filled the room. Briggs shifted in his chair, his face slick with sweat. Christopher broke the silence, his voice steady. This wasn't just about me. This was about what happens every day on these streets, to men who look like me, men who don't have the shield of a title or a government position to protect them. What if I hadn't been chief investigator? What if I had just been another citizen driving home from work? How would this have ended? The panel members exchanged grim looks. One of them, a senior officer with decades of service, leaned forward. Officer Briggs, this department cannot and will not tolerate racial profiling, harassment, or the abuse of authority. Not against a White House agent, not against a civilian, not against anyone. Effective immediately, you are terminated from this force. Briggs's world collapsed in that single sentence. His badge was stripped, his weapon taken, his career ended with finality. Christopher rose from his seat, gathering his documents. He looked once at Briggs, his expression unreadable but his words sharp as steel. Respect is free, officer, but tonight you learned what disrespect costs. A career, a reputation, and the illusion of power you thought you held. He turned and walked out, leaving Briggs alone in the sterile room, the echo of the words ringing louder than any siren. And that was the end of Officer Briggs's career. What do you think was firing him enough? Or should he have faced criminal charges for abuse of power? Let me know in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories that reveal the real cost of arrogance, prejudice, and disrespect.